I just want to start off by welcoming everybody to this SDG Literacy and Connected Planet event this evening. And I want to give a particular welcome to students from the Postgraduate Certificate in Sustainability, Leadership and Business programme, and to my programme colleagues, Dr. Lucia Walsh and Alico McAlpine. I also want to welcome Dr. Cormac McMahon, Rebecca Flanagan, and colleagues from our SDG Literacy Community of Practice for Sustainability Education. And finally, I would like to thank our Faculty Dean, Dr. Owen Langan, and faculty colleagues, Dr. Etienne Kidney, Dr. Colin Hughes, Dr. Ashley O'Donoghue, and Maria Fitzgerald for their support for this event. I am absolutely delighted to welcome Dr. Erinch Sahan here this evening. Erinch is the Business and Enterprise Lead at Doughnut Economics Action Lab. His background spans business, government, social enterprise and NGOs. And prior to joining DEAL, he was Chief Executive of the World Fair Trade Organization. And prior to that, he spent 7 years leading campaign and advocacy initiatives at Oxfam, where he also founded Oxfam's Future of Business initiative. Many of you here are familiar with the ideas of doughnut economics and of the growing belief that the time for business as usual is over, as we must find a way to meet the needs of all people within the means of the living planet. The question as to how business can transform to become regenerative or circular by design, and how economies can transform to distribute value more equally among those who help generate it, are not easily answered. But Erinch has dedicated much of his work to developing transformative business models and practices. And through his role in Doughnut Economics Action Lab, he will educate businesses on how they can drive the transformative agenda forward. This evening, his talk is entitled When Business Meets the Doughnut. So I will now hand over to Erinch so we can learn something about what embarking that transformative agenda entails. So, thank you.
Be with you all today. I'm going to speak for about 30 minutes on doughnut economics and what it means for business. I assume some of you would have heard of the concept of doughnut economics, but let's begin with a bit of a reminder about what it is and why it came to being. So,
sorry, Erinch, sorry to interrupt you again. Just to let you know, we can see your version of slides.
Ah, yes, I will swap these around. There we go.
That's it. Thank you.
Wonderful. So, how the 21st century has begun? Well, it's been a century of crisis. It's been a century that has initially begun with a financial meltdown that many of you might remember from 2008 that really shook the world economy. It was a meltdown that caused a huge crisis around the world. But of course, the last decade and beyond has seen an increasing prevalence of climate breakdowns from extreme weather events happening everywhere around the world, not distinguishing particularly where it is hitting, and the chaos that has created, to the COVID lockdown, which was an effect of the way we have encroached into nature and the way that has impacted our health and viruses and various other developments in the biological sphere. So from meltdowns to breakdowns to lockdowns, the 21st century has been a century of crises. In response to this, what we propose is a doughnut as a compass for human prosperity. Now, let me explain why this is called a doughnut and why doughnut economics is a way of looking at the future for human prosperity. Well, firstly, you'll notice there are two concentric circles. So there's an outer concentric circle that encapsulates the 9 planetary boundaries that Earth system scientists have developed, have uncovered and analyzed as being boundaries that we must not transgress. We must not overshoot these 9 planetary boundaries. However, 10 years ago, my colleague and friend, Kate Rayworth, looked at this and was working with planetary boundary experts and Earth system scientists and felt like something was missing. If we are just looking at the ecological ceiling and just looking at planetary boundaries, we are missing the fact that we also need to meet the basic needs of all the people on this planet. We were missing a social foundation. So she drew an internal circle, a social foundation that would demonstrate a barrier that we must not fall short of. These encapsulate the basic needs for humanity and come from the Sustainable Development Goals, the social parts of the Sustainable Development Goals. So together, these represent boundaries that determine what a safe and just space for humanity must become. And incidentally, it looks like a donut. So donut economics was born. Now, how are we doing with this in mind? Well, if we were to take a selfie as a species and we're looking at how we're doing collectively, perhaps this picture would describe the situation, would describe our collective selfie. We are failing. We are in overshoot on our planet's resources, and we are in shortfall on life's essentials. To put it in the words of potential business people or accountants, they might say we are overusing our budget and under-delivering on our outcomes. There is something broken in our economic system if this is the result that we have created. And of course, this looks similar, but in many ways distinct in different countries around the world. Countries that we might look to as being developed economies in the past, or countries that are characterized as high income economies, have created high degrees of wealth and income and met a lot of the needs of their populations by mostly overusing their fair share of the Earth's natural resources. That's a trajectory that middle income countries are on as well, including countries like China and India. However, when we look at the global south, when we look at countries that are characterized as lower income countries, the reverse is true, which is they are not using their fair share of the Earth's resources and are under-delivering significantly on life's essential. Now, we can switch over other countries into this and the picture looks the same. What it tells us is that every nation must transform. Every country is a developing country now, and we need to transform the deep design of our economies around the world. So where does all this come from? Why have we seen a situation where we have created an economy that is both creating an overshoot on our planet's boundaries and is in shortfall on life's essentials for all the people on our planet? Well, essentially, it's a degenerative model of take, make, use, lose, where we take from Earth, we make stuff, we use this stuff, and then we lose the stuff. And this process is repeated over and over again. It's a linear model that is degenerative by design. Our grandchildren, our great-great-grandchildren would one day ask us, did you know about this? Did you know this was the economy that we had created? This was the economy that we were addicted to, that unless this was happening, we were no longer in a situation of economic growth and we were in an economic crisis. We've self-defined an economic system that is addicted to this model. Now, there is hope. We're beginning to see alternatives emerge. Those alternatives that take us from a degenerative dynamic where we are running down Earth's life supporting systems to a regenerative one where we work with and within the cycles of the living world. Put simply, this is a circular economy model of the world, one where there are two separate loops going on, one for biological materials that have come from Earth and can go back into Earth. And we try to regenerate in the way that we consume and use those resources. On the other hand, there are technical materials, man-made, human-made materials that are to be restored, that are to be reused and repaired and recycled where possible. And we can design our products and our economies around these loops. There are many examples of companies taking this forward. So, for instance, if we were to look at the mobile phone industry, we might come across a business called Fairphone, a business that has designed deliberately a modular phone that minimizes waste, that allows for repair, allows for upgrades, and is designed to be regenerative, to take this idea into the core of the business. It's not perfect, but it is making attempts that many, most, nearly all of its competitors in this industry, its peers, are not doing, who are instead pursuing a strategy of built-in obsolescence. Companies like Interface that have looked to Mother Nature for inspiration and said, can our factories behave as forests? They've asked the question of nature. Well, nature has been evolving for 3.8 billion years. And what can we learn from its evolution as a designer of systems, of processes? And it said that, well, if we were not here as a factory, we were not here as a business, how could the wildland behave in our place? Well, it would be generous. It would be cleaning the air. It would be cleaning the water below the ground. It would be sequestering carbon. It would be providing nutrients back into the soil. It would be cooling down the local environment on hot summer days. It would be providing all these generous services back within itself, and it would be in a relationship of mutualism within itself. Now, it said, how can we then behave as generously as the wildland next door? So started designing factories and production models that begin to mimic some of those biological processes that keep Earth stable and local communities going. Another example from Kenya, a business called Sanergy, which has said, well, how can we actually close the biological loop by creating toilets in underserviced areas, in some of the poorest areas and slums of Nairobi, but then use the output of those, so essentially the poo that is collected, to then turn that into safe fertilizer that can be used for natural fertilizing of agricultural lands to increase productivity, increase support to local farmers in a way that is both organic and using the waste that humans are creating in a much more regenerative way. And another example is circularity of materials. Business like Houdini, which is based in Sweden, and it has not only created a circular garment where essentially the natural fibers can easily be separated from the synthetic fibers and they go into separate loops. And in fact, they grow food from the natural fibers that are no longer reusable, and they decompost and they allow for food production to happen that is then served in the shops where they are selling their products back to the customers. But they are making their designs open source. So they're saying to the rest of their industry, look, we're not here to compete. We're not here to become the biggest company in this sector. We need to collaborate. The only way we're going to have this transformation happen in our industry is if we build on each other's knowledge, if we build on each other's work. So let's put our resources, let's put our technology and our intellectual property as open source. So you can build on it, and let's have a relationship that is collaborative rather than purely competitive. Now that is a big idea and leans into some of the ideas in the social domain. So the ideas I've just presented are mostly in the ecological domain, but the social domain is also a transformation that has to happen. We need to go from a divisive economy that has seen spiraling inequality, particularly within countries around the world, where value and opportunity are captured in the hands of an increasingly fewer and fewer people, to a distributive one, where the economy is designed to distribute opportunity and value with all who co-create it. There are inspirations here as well. Companies leading the way, companies demonstrating what's possible. One example of a company I got to know very well during the COVID-19 crisis is El Puente. Now, El Puente is a German importer of food and fashion and homewares products from around the world. It distributes those across mainland Western Europe, essentially. And what El Puente did when the COVID-19 crisis hit was to double down on its support to its suppliers, those producers, the farmer cooperatives, the suppliers of its garments and homewares around the world. Now, this was important because it was a period, and I saw this firsthand, where global companies and brands were cutting and running. They were canceling orders. They were renegotiating prices and contracts. They were looking for loopholes. That meant that they didn't have to stick to their commitments because they wanted to minimize the amount of cash flow that would leave their business in a time of uncertainty. This led to huge crises, particularly pushing down the risks and the pressures into countries and places that could least afford it. These were the very countries that were producing the products that were being sold around the world, but at that very moment in time, the trade had stalled. What El Puente did was the opposite. It basically said, look, we're going to pay upfront for orders that we don't know when you can deliver. We know there's a lockdown potentially in your country. We know that shipping lanes might be closed. We know that retail outlets are closed. We know that things are stalled, but we know you also need to pay your staff. We know you need to sustain yourself as a social enterprise or a producer farmer cooperative. So we're going to keep paying you, and we'll take the order of the products when it is ready. This additional financial flexibility meant a lot of those producer cooperatives survived the crisis. And why was El Puente able to behave in that way when its competitors and peers in the broader industry were not? Well, it's a multi-stakeholder model. So if you go to a board meeting of El Puente, what you'll find is there is a representative of the farmers and the workers who are making the products in its supply chain sitting there on equal footing with the founders of the business, with the employee representatives of the business, with the shops that sell the products of the business. It has a model where its board actually contains various ideas of various stakeholder groups represented there. The ownership model represents this as well. So When there's a big decision to be made, suddenly those that are in most need have a voice at the highest table. Other examples like employee ownership are beginning to take off. Richer Sounds converted itself after a successful several decades of expanding across the UK retail sector to double down on its commitment to employees, where in a sector where 0-hour contracts and low levels of commitment to staff were becoming more and more prominent, they said, look, our values are the opposite. The staff are the ones that make this business go and they make it successful. And we're going to transition ownership to an employee ownership model. That meant that things were distributive. When there's a profit, it gets shared more broadly. Of course, there are others as well. And the cooperative movement has produced many new innovative models of cooperatives. And there's an idea of platform cooperativism that has also grown recently. Airbnb is an example of this. It's a co-ownership model that means that the platform is used for good. It means that half the revenue that's collected goes back into local community groups to make sure that the benefits of tourism are shared locally. It also makes sure that they promote slow tourism, that they also are stopping any large landowners from profiteering from the business. So you can only have a couple of listings and it's used in a fair and just way. And of course, the issue of tax comes up here. When we talk distributive, we're also talking here about fair tax, because of course, social services, as well as essential services like healthcare, education, as well as infrastructure, policing, all these things are needed for businesses to thrive. So paying a fair amount of tax seems to be very critical here. Of course, majority of the industries don't practice this. The practice of minimizing tax bills is extremely common and prevalent across most normal companies. However, all of these kinds of experiences are fairly exceptional. Unfortunately, they are being held back across most of the mainstream business world. And what we're beginning to see is that we need a transformation from the degenerative and divisive towards the regenerative and distributive. And that transition is going to involve the commons. It's going to involve public services and governments and NGOs and charities and communities. Non-business groups are going to be critical. However, we're going to need business playing a huge role if we're going to pivot the economy. And currently, the way we have designed businesses means that only those where you can do the right thing when it is allowing for maximum margins and maximum dividends is limiting what is possible. There are loads of ideas that get held back because it doesn't quite fit in the box of maximizing margins and maximizing profits. However, we can get around this. We can actually design business in a different way, where there are viable strategies that are commercially successful, but are focused on being regenerative and distributive. And this means that there's a journey of redesign that happens. So what do we want to unlock here if we are to redesign business? Well, we want to unlock an idea that is on the regenerative side that I introduced earlier. But that means that our mindset needs to move a little bit further than the current thinking. Currently, we have a degenerative model, like landscape degradation, built-in obsolescence that I went through earlier. And we're trying to get to sustainable. We're saying, let's minimize the harm we're doing. Let's get to zero deforestation. Let's get to 100% recyclable. All right, well, that stops the bleeding. That stops some of the continuation of harm. But actually, we need to repair some of the harm. And the way nature works actually has a regenerative model built in. There isn't any waste in nature. Everything is benefiting something else. The output of one thing is an input to another. We can design economies in a similar way. So why wouldn't we take those same principles and make regenerative the broader goal, where we are doing good rather than just zero harm? The same is true on the social front. We can move away from some of the divisive practices where we see hyper competition or we see poverty wages, and we're starting to see a lot of very important initiatives such as living wage or collaborations within industries that are promoting the right kind of actions and strategies. But we could go further. If we want to actually tackle the inequality that we're beginning to see, we need to be distributive. That means that living wage, which is enough to meet the basic needs, is not tackling inequality. It's not sufficient. We need to go beyond that. And maybe that means we start doing profit sharing, as a part of the model, or we start having open source design that creates a much more distributive and decentralized industry models of the future. So what's stopping us from doing things like this? I mean, if you were to put these ideas on the table, look, I'm going to pay a living wage and a profit share. I'm going to have open source product design out there. If you put those ideas on the table, most companies would actually say, sorry, that's not viable. And what we did is over the last year, we've done 23 different workshop series with companies around the world. Over 300 companies participated. And we found that there were ways that the companies were being held back. They were being held back by outdated processes, by rigid financial targets, by short-term thinking and a culture of hierarchy. And instead, the companies that could move forward were challenging that by suspending practicality for a minute to think, well, what do we need to do? Not just what is possible today. And they were bringing in broader perspectives and long-term thinking, and they were bringing in a culture of courage. We did a bit of an activity with these companies, and we continue to do so. And we've just launched a tool actually for anybody to use. It's in the Commons in order for those to take business through a bit of a journey on enterprise design. And it includes this question, which is, let's start by visualizing that thriving future, that future that is regenerative and distributive. So we're in the donut. We're not transgressing the planetary boundaries, and we're delivering life's essentials for everybody. And your business is a part of that. You belong to that. Your industry is transformed. You have transformed. Now imagine that future. Hold it for a minute. What has your business started doing? And what has it now stopped doing? Now, to start imagining these things that you might need to start doing and stop doing, you might need to actually talk to activists. You might need to ask Extinction Rebellion or junior colleagues. You might need to ask technical experts and industry leaders. Well, what are the biggest ideas? What are those huge transformative ideas? And then we hold those for a second and say, right, let's test the ideas we've come up with. These big transformative ideas that will belong to a future economy that is both regenerative and distributive. And we ask them, well, let's bring in other voices. Let's bring in the voices of those that can help you determine what is possible and what is needed. And those might end up being voices of employees. It might be voices of local communities or customers. It might also need to go expand into the voices of the supply chain, those workers, farmers, and artisans and communities in the supply chain that maybe we're not accustomed to bringing into the conversation or hearing from. Might be about bringing the voice of forests and rivers, air and soil, the living planet. I mean, we can have methodologies for doing this. The company Faith in Nature has put as a board member Lawyers for Nature, which has the role of representing the perspective of nature in our living planet on their board. It has a voting seat on the board to make sure it is a part. We saw recently Patagonia change its model to bring in Earth as a core shareholder. And we're going to talk a little bit about that model in a second. Other models like River Simple, a company based in Scotland creating hydrogen cars, has got a model where there is a custodian for the planet on its board, and their responsibility is completely to the living planet. So it's possible to bring these other voices in, but let's go further. What about future generations? What would future generations tell us? Looking back, saying, look, clearly you need to discontinue that product line. Clearly you need to divest from that area. Clearly you need to change your core business model from one focused on product A to maybe one focused on service B. So those end up being a methodology for putting those huge ideas on the table. But then we need to ask, so how do we enable them? Because often we're going to come up with ideas that are not possible, that are held back for one reason or another within the company. And we see that there are many ways and ideas for transforming business. There's the approach of exerting public pressure, so critical, bringing regulations in, bringing the voice of consumers, of workers, of farmers, of communities, of investors to exert pressure on a company. But of course, there's the enlightened leadership route, trying to get C-suites and high up executives into the role of driving change. And then there's the idea of setting targets and metrics. So just being better about crunching the numbers, figuring out impact. And there's the idea of making the business case more effectively. So saying that actually in the long term, you'll make more money because the consumer will reward you, or you'll overcome future regulations that are going to come in anyway. You'll be ahead of the curve, or you'll find efficiencies, or you'll attract better staff, or you'll get investors that care about this stuff on board, so you make the case. These are all amazing levers for change. Very important, all need to happen together. But what we're saying is that there's another one, and there's one that cuts across all this and can enable all of this, because we try to re-engineer and redesign the business world to pursue the bold and ambitious ideas that we're coming up with. And here's a way that we have seen that this is critical. So in our journey over the last couple of years, what we have learned is we spoke to a very senior executive from a large footwear brand that I can't disclose, but you've all heard of this company. And he told us that, look, I've been here for years, for over 20 years. And as a legacy, what I wanted to do is make sure that we use our position to create affordable footwear that is ergonomically beneficial and that is expandable, so that parents in countries around the world can buy one pair of shoes that are really good for that child, and through the life of that child's childhood can be expanded and will continue to be fit for use. We prototyped that expandable shoe. It was going to be profitable, but it wouldn't have hit our usual margins, so we dropped it. We met another senior executive for a major beauty brand that had set very ambitious climate goals that said, look, we're going to really roll up our sleeves, have net zero carbon by year X, Y. We're ambitious here, we're going to do it. And then they realized actually what they need to do was to focus on the fact that most of the carbon emissions are coming from the glass and the pumps and the packaging of their product. So it would mean that they should introduce refillable perfume bottles. But they told us that bringing consumers on board needs investment, and the payback period on that capital expenditure is too long, so we can't do it. Another head of innovation at a major clothing company told us, I've been asked to create a range of regenerative clothing while being expected to deliver the usual 15% profit margins from the outset. This is impossible. We hear this time and time again. These are all manifestations, symptoms of a design of the business world that is not fit for the challenges of the 21st century. These are all manifestations of an enterprise design that is fit for a 20th century world based on financial capital scarcity. And optimizing for financial capital scarcity is a very different thing than optimizing for meeting the 21st century social and ecological challenges that are both urgent and very prominent. So what have we done? What do we propose? Well, what we propose is this framework, looking at the purpose, the networks, the governance, ownership and finance of business, a deep design journey through an enterprise. One where we move away from the 20th century question that is degenerative and divisive, that says how much value can we extract through this enterprise, to the 21st century version, which is for regenerative and distributive economics, that says how many benefits can we generate through this enterprise. Now, through every aspect of this purpose, networks, governance, ownership, and finance, things can be designed into the core of the business that push towards the 21st century question. We borrowed and were inspired by the work of Marjorie Kelly, who's an author and theorist that wrote the book Owning Our Future over 10 years ago, who came up with essentially the underpinnings of this framework. And we've worked with her and collaborated to come up with the following. So let's explore purpose. What do we mean by purpose? Well, for us, purpose is clearly about what the business even exists for. What is its core reason for being? And is it about profit-driven business or purpose-driven business? And where would we notice if it's purpose-driven? Well, we would see it in what it does to serve the world, but we would see it manifested in its operations, in its supply chain, in its products and its services, and how it behaves. So if you take fast fashion, for instance, the core of its purpose is to produce clothes that are as cheap as possible, as low cost as possible, and as much as possible. So its core purpose is to sell as many clothes and produce as many clothes as possible. That has huge ramifications for its supply chain, for those in its supply chain that are a cost burden to that business model. But if we were to look at the alternative, a business, again, I got to know very well, called Manos del Uruguay. It's collectively owned by 12 different women's producer cooperatives spread across Uruguay. It's been around since the 1960s, and it's successful. Its products are sold in high-end retailers in New York and Paris, and it's able to make every decision based on what would benefit local ecology and the local people of our core producer organizations. So it's using natural fibers, it's using slow fashion, it's creating products based on indigenous design and knowledge, and it's making sure all of its profits and all of its decisions are focused on the well-being of its local communities. That is a different purpose from a fast fashion mass production model at its very heart. I'm going to race through the next few a bit more quickly. So networks, this is essentially about the relationships the business holds with its suppliers, with the rest of its industry, with its government. And essentially, do we have these commodified short-term extractive relationships, such as tax avoidance, such as regressive lobbying? Or do we have these collaborative partnerships that are based on long-term commitments, that are based on fair tax, that are based on progressive lobbying and cooperation in industries? Then we move into governance. So governance is very much about the decision-making, the power relationships, whose voice is represented, who's in a position of power and influence in shaping the priorities of a business. So questions come up about who is on the board and who has a voice for decision-making, not just the individuals, but who represents them and who appoints them, who has a voice in their accountability. And essentially about the rules of the company, the metrics of success, and the transparency around its financial accounts and beyond. An example here is River Simple, that company I mentioned earlier, where it's got a custodianship model. So every kind of stakeholder group that is impacted directly by the business has an individual on its board that is a custodian for them. So it exists for that reason to take a balanced approach. Then we move to ownership models. These obviously overlap significantly with each other. Ownership influences governance, which influences purpose and networks. But it's important to also zoom into some of these. So let's think about those extractive models that can be all about increasing returns to its owners and can hold back regenerative and distributive ideas. And let's think about the alternatives that are emerging. Of course, there are lots of employee ownership models. There's lots of hybrid models of community ownership. But of course, there is this model called steward ownership, exemplified recently by the conversion of the company Patagonia into a model where part of its shares went to a trust that would control all of the voting rights, and part of its shares went to an ecological NGO that would receive all of the surplus, so all of the profits of the business and the dividends. Now, those that control the dividends do not have a way to influence the company. They don't have the voting shares, but those have the voting shares don't have a financial interest in the business. It was a way of separating power and money in the ownership model that liberated the company to focus on its core social and ecological goals. Then we move to finance, and essentially the question of where does the finance come from? What does it demand? And is a finance serving financial returns, or is it serving a broader purpose? Questions come up around flexibility on margins, on dividend expectation, rules on reinvestment and profit allocation within the company, around what's a fair return for investors. These are uncomfortable questions about money, but that is critical. I mean, most of the actions and investments and strategies we need from the business world are about money. How is money going to shape, and the expectations of money and the distribution of money going to enable or inhibit the kind of actions we need? I worked on a partnership a few years ago between the Body Shop and a local social enterprise in India that's based out of Canada called Plastics for Change, to make sure that the waste pickers in India were going to receive the kind of treatment that fair trade can bring in, to make sure that they were going to have a long-term commitment towards them, to make sure that they were organized in producer groups where there was some kind of democratic governance model, to make sure that the prices paid allowed for a dignified life for those waste pickers. All of that was enabled because the Body Shop had a program called the Community Trade Program that could have some flexibility around its financial parameters. Its finance was adapting in order to serve purpose. So to summarize the points I've just raised, essentially the claim here is that we need to redesign business. But to redesign business, actually we achieve a lot of other things. We achieve the purpose of aligning the internal processes of the company with the business purpose. So think of the product design processes that can be aligned with the core purpose of the business. We can enable partnerships and engage stakeholders more effectively in order to bring some of those, for instance, supply chain actors into the ownership, into the governance, make them long-term partners and make them feel like they are co-owners of the business long-term, creating supply chain security and long-term relationships. We can channel investment into long-term transformative ideas, such as the River Simple model, by having a particular governance model and a particular relationship with finance that is focused on decisions that unlock the internal investment rather than try to extract dividends ever more and at an ever-growing rate. And we can lock in legacy, protect the mission of a company by designing this in to make sure it can't be diverted away. If you think here about the Patagonia model, that is designed to make sure that those that have an interest in growing returns, here it might be an ecological NGO, but it could be something else. They're not the ones that have a control over the legacy and the mission. It is the trust that is the holder of the purpose. And it's that steward ownership model that is so prevalent in Northern Europe and is growing across the world. And of course, the most important thing is if we redesign business around these ideas, it could be regenerative and distributive by design in order to help humanity into the donut. If these ideas are of interest, we've launched a tool. I've got the website written there. It's at doughnuteconomics.org. But if you go to Deal's webpage, doughnuteconomics.org, it's easy to find. It's in the tools section, or it's in the business and enterprise thematic section. It's in the news section as well, and events. So there's lots of routes in. It's everywhere. It's hard to miss. It's a tool that essentially allows any individual, any organization to engage with the concept of how do we redesign business in order to help humanity into the donut. I'll stop sharing my screen and look forward to some questions and discussion.
I managed to unmute us there, Erin. Thank you so much for a really, really stimulating presentation. We have got questions online. Lucia Walsh is looking after the questions online, and I'm going to look after the questions here in the room. So maybe we might look to the room first. If anybody has a question, you want to raise your hand. People are still processing. Somebody at the back of the room. Yes.
Patagonia seems to be put forward all the time as the star performer in terms of companies. Like you referenced a few companies that you've worked with. We're looking to name them at the moment. Why is it so slow that other kind of high street names are not kind of adapting to some of these principles that you referenced there today?
Yeah, fantastic question. If I can dive straight into answer it, I mean, you're right. There is something that is holding back businesses from taking on these actions, and I think it's implicit in my presentation that the examples I gave are exceptions. These aren't the mainstream. Some of them might be household names like Patagonia, but essentially most of the high streets of the world, or the main streets of the world, are held back from doing this. And a lot of it is because of the way financial markets are set up. But on the other hand, it's because we've been agnostic to business design. We've just asked business to behave differently. We've said, you should do this, it's the right thing to do. Or we've said, oh, you'll make more money, or just measure this differently and do the right thing. And let's put a bit of pressure on it. All of that is potentially helpful. But I think what's been missing is that we haven't shaped the design of future enterprises. I mean, most of today's companies were not around 40 or 50 years ago. They were designed 40 or 50. We could have designed them differently. I mean, imagine the way Wikipedia is designed as a foundation-owned model. A lot of Silicon Valley organizations could have been that way if this was a deliberate policy. So part of it is government and governance has been agnostic to enterprise design and said, look, let's just let the market rip and see whatever organizational model comes up, we'll run with it. But what's come up is a model that is focused in a very obsessive and extreme way on increasing returns at any price, and is organized in order to hold itself account on that way. And I think we have to now be deliberate to pull it back and say, look, let's create diverse alternatives. And I think there's an opportunity to do that because it's not working. Just pleading with the business world and asking it to behave differently isn't working. The regulations are helping here and there, but they're not going far enough. And I think there's an opportunity for those across the business world to redesign structurally business so that it serves what we need from it in the 21st century.
Thank you, Erinch. I think I see Cormac McMahon's hand raised online. Do you want to come in, Cormac?
Yeah, thanks, Olivia, and thanks, Aaron, for that really enjoyable presentation. I'm kind of just thinking out loud here in terms of the potential application or roles maybe for universities in this. And if I just reflect back to sort of our de facto model of supporting enterprise in universities is very much around, let's say, the traditional startup type of model where we engage with investors and so on, which are very numbers driven in terms of showing growth and profits and so on. Is there a role for universities in, let's say, applying your tools with local businesses and communities and guiding them through that type of methodology so they think about their impact, if that makes sense?
Absolutely, Cormac. This is so topical, actually. Just 2 hours ago, I convened a group of business schools around the world who had raised this, and they approached us and said, look, we want to have a call. We think that, and this was just over a dozen business schools from around the world who said, we think there's a lot we can do. We can do something on research because we need to pivot the research into identifying the impact that enterprise design has on what is possible, what is allowed and not allowed by a business. But we think we can do something on business teaching as well. So we think that actually students can take these tools, and they absolutely can, because two of our pilots deliberately tested this with business students. One was at LSE in London, the other was with the Centre for Economic Transformation in Amsterdam, and it absolutely works. Students can take these tools, apply them to a company that they've analyzed and looked into, and propose the kind of enterprise design changes that can unlock those bold transformative ideas. But the third area is engaging their network of businesses around them, their community of businesses, and taking them through it. So the tools are there, very much tailored for organizations like business schools to engage with their local community and take the conversation to the next level. Not just ask, why aren't you pursuing these regenerative or distributive ideas, but how may you evolve in order to unlock these? And what could that evolution look like? When could it happen? And how can we ease into it to make it possible? So I absolutely think it has a huge role. And probably the fourth one I would add to that is universities are anchor institutions. They're institutions that procure products from around themselves. They have service contracts. They have an economic footprint of their own. And if they were to bring this perspective into their own operations, actually they can move mountains, especially if they move together with other anchor institutions in their community. Institutions like local government, institutions like hospitals. You bring that collective procurement power together and say, look, we're going to look at ownership model. We're going to preference businesses that have a multi-stakeholder approach. We're going to preference businesses that have boards that represent various kinds of organizations and impacts. You can suddenly start transforming the conversation locally. So I think universities can be incredibly ambitious and can drive a lot of change.
Thanks, Aaron. I really appreciate that.
Thanks, Erinch. I might go to Lucia next. I know Lucia is monitoring the questions that are coming in the chat. So you might call on a couple there, Lucia.
Thank you for that very presentation. Can you hear me?
It's a little bit low, Lucia.
Perhaps those in the chat would like to ask questions themselves. I'm not sure.
I saw Connor Horan had a question there. Connor, do you want to come in?
We have Gabriela ask first. So Gabriela, if you want to ask a question, and then we might move to Connor's very simple question.
Who did you want to bring in first?
Gabriela?
Gabriella, is it?
Yeah.
I can't hear you, Lucia. I'm going to go to Connor first, if that's okay. Well, you see what's happening with your volume. Okay, Connor, do you want to come in?
Cheers. Thanks, Olivia. I think my question is probably the big, broad challenge, and I see it as a political question rather than anything else. If the neoliberal free market economic model for profit shareholder theory is so dominant, is this not really a political debate around shifting the thinking away from pure profit? And if it is so dominant, really the argument is that sustainability will never get a look in terms of management decision making, and how do you shift managers away from this rational economic view of the world, a marginal analysis view of the world, to saying, okay, we have to forego something here for sustainability. And my question is really down at the level of decision making, and I'm wondering what you think of that.
You're absolutely right, Connor, that there is the broader policy ecosystem has decided this is what we need to design one way or another. I mean, we have created Corporations Acts. We have created the concept of fiduciary duty for boards towards shareholders. We have created financial markets and the way they work and the accountability that business has towards their owners through financial. These are human-made things. They don't walk around in the forest. If you go up to the closest wildland, you won't see a fiduciary duty document walking around, or you won't see, a shareholder wealth maximizing corporate model walking around. We made these things up because it felt like, for various reasons, the right thing to do for some people in power at the time. So we can make up alternatives. But I think that change is going to be led by if we just wait for political change to happen on its own, it's not going to be sufficient, or it's not going to be fast enough. What I found in my work, working on government regulation change around the world and working on corporate change around the world in various guys. I did a lot of campaigning. I did a lot of activism in different countries, working on these kinds of issues, is that when we can demonstrate there is a part of the business world that is leading the charge, that is a part of the business world that is transforming into what the economy needs to become, policymakers can become emboldened, and they can use this as legitimacy. They can use this as ambition for what they're trying to create. So there is a huge role. I wouldn't underestimate the role that founders of new businesses have, that those that can reshape private companies or even reshape some publicly listed companies could have, that, research coming out. And I think on all of this, it's going to feel marginal and it's going to feel slow until it doesn't, until we hit a tipping point, until suddenly we start seeing the change come through and it looks inevitable, it looks viable, and actually we don't have time to wait for the current models to just evolve slowly into something a little bit less bad. We're going to, I think, get to a point where the new models, the ideas of the next economy are alive among us, and they're demonstrating that they're viable, and they're demonstrating that they're better for society and community and planet. And then I think policymakers step up into a point of taking it much more seriously and pushing the change. So I think it's incumbent on all of us to stick with the discomfort of feeling like this is small, this isn't changing very much, but keep pushing on that, keeping the conversation at that radical level of structural change in business.
Great, thank you.
Lucia.
Okay, can you hear me better now?
Yes.
Oh, great. Okay. So we have lots of questions, but I might go to Claire's question. I don't know if Claire Allen, if you want to ask the question yourself, or would you like me to ask? Anyway, Claire wants to know how she can convince her organization to adopt this model. So you went through some really interesting tools and that make sense to us, but how do you convince the decision makers?
I think there isn't a one size fits all, and I think this is a game of getting the right dance happening in different businesses and organizations. So we did this with lots of different companies that are at different levels of ambition, different levels of evolution. And for each of them, the journey was a little bit different, but there were a few common things. One was finding a pragmatic reason why this needs to happen, and finding a pragmatic reason why actually the design of the business also needs to evolve. It will be helpful to change who's represented on the board. It will be helpful to change the way profits are dealt in order to enable the investment into these big ideas, to belong to that future economy. And to do that, maybe it's about bringing together some people and finding the language that doesn't immediately threaten those that might need to change, and try to bring in someone with agency into that process. So if you go to our talk, Claire, you can, at doughuteconomics.org, you can take that as a workshop and run it within your organization with a handful of colleagues and others to see, okay, what does this look like within our organization, and How can we change and evolve our deep design in order to enable these very exciting new ideas that we're beginning to envision?
Okay, are there any other questions in the room? Just to come back to the room here. If you have any, you raise your hand, get my attention, because we've only got a couple more minutes left. But Lucia, do you want to select another question there from online?
Yeah, so we have two kind of links. They are kind of specific to Ireland and Dublin. So Gabriela is asking about what you think about Dublin's donut model, if you're familiar with it. And then Jackie had a question as well with regards to Enterprise Ireland and what is the role. Maybe Jackie wants to ask that question herself because her hand is up.
Yeah, sure. I suppose it's really interesting what you're saying about the role of universities, because I'm not sure if you're aware, there's a company called Food Cloud, is social entrepreneur, and they came out of the Innovation Hub in Trinity. So it's really interesting that what you're saying about third level being that piece. But I suppose in relation to, and I kind of agree with you, it's kind of creating a storm so that it becomes a thing you don't do anymore as opposed to the thing you have to switch to do. But my question really then relates to, if you can't address it at a policy level or drive that huge change, it's kind of got to be incremental until it's a tipping point. Where does the role of startup funding have to change in order to be able to assist that tipping point is what my question is. And what have you seen in other countries that work?
Thank you, Jackie. And also just to address the earlier question, I'm not very familiar with the Doughnut Dublin work, and I know that the communities in Ireland that have taken Doughnut economics and started applying it at community level and at city level are phenomenal. And my colleagues that work on communities and cities always talk about how amazing and inspiring the work has been and how it's sort of driving the agenda of what Doughnut economics looks like at a place-based level. But I work on the business side in terms of how do we transform business. And Jackie, your question is at the heart of a lot of things, because enterprise development and I think universities have this huge role to play in shaping, for instance, all the research that happens. It turns into businesses. There's a commercialization model. But what we found is that they channel those commercializations through the venture capital route, which is the regular way of going, okay, and what does venture capital want? Well, it wants unicorn. What does that mean? It means that they want businesses that grow into 30, 40 times the investment that was put into them. So high risk, incredibly exponential high return, and they push and push and push the business to grow as fast as possible. It doesn't matter if some fall over, they factor that in, but as long as a few of them make it into the dreamland of being a unicorn, then it's fine. That's incredibly destructive. We're losing businesses that are maybe viable, that don't grow at 30x, that grow maybe twice or grow organically and don't need to become, huge companies, and maybe just need to have scale through replication rather than one big massive company. I mean, if you look at a forest, you don't see a tree that becomes the entire forest. You see lots and lots of trees coexisting and cooperating with each other, competing too, but cooperating as well, and mutualism. And I think that process can come in. And I think the enterprise development agenda of universities can really lead the way here. They can be deliberate. And honestly, we designed this tool with that model in mind. We were approached by a number of universities who said, look, we're interested in doing something different. And we created these workshops to say, okay, well, put your entrepreneurs and founders and scientists and researchers through this process. Let them choose. Maybe they will choose a different ownership model. Maybe they'll choose a different governance model. Maybe they'll want to lock in their mission. Maybe they don't want to grow to 30x and are happy with a certain, cap on the upside, but retaining the core mission and having a different way of collaborating across their industry. And the tool is sort of there to guide that process, and it gives all of the necessary guidance, all the contents and everything I presented with lots more behind it, as well as case studies and examples and canvases to print or to do it as Miro boards. So all the activities are there for anybody to run that workshop. And I would love to see enterprise development initiatives linked at universities, whether it's a startup hub or whatever it is, accelerator program, start to use that. We're doing that around the world with different accelerator programs, and would love to see that happen in Dublin as well.
Thank you. That's great. Thank you.
Thanks, and thanks to everybody online for your really good questions. If it's okay, Aaron, we have one last question here in the room. I'm conscious of time, so we'll hope it's a quick one. And I'll hand over to the.
Thanks, Eric. My question, I suppose, was: is there an evidence base of profitability or viability for the companies that have been formed this way? Like, because I mean, there's a threshold level of if it's not viable, it's not going to happen.
Absolutely. So one of the last things I did when I was leading the World Fair Trade Organization was be a part of a research project on what we called new enterprise models for the new economy. And we looked at enterprises that were designed essentially in this way. And we looked at how they were doing commercially. What we found was that they were 4 times more resilient than regular small and medium enterprises. Not 4 times more profitable, but 4 times more resilient. So they were getting through crises because the way they've set themselves up is a relationship of codependence with their suppliers, with their commercial partners, with their communities. And when things get tough, people band together. They have a level of flexibility and support for each other. And they get through crises together. So these companies, these kinds of companies live longer, they last longer, and they support their communities longer. They might not deliver higher dividends to their owners and shareholders, but they become more successful companies commercially by surviving and thriving in their local community. I think here the biggest distinction to maybe take away is the difference between profitability and commercial success on the one hand, and profit maximization and going for the highest possible growth on the other. And those two pushes take the business world into very different realities. But absolutely, I mean, at the heart of your question is the point that we need businesses that survive. A bankrupt business is no good for anybody. We need businesses that survive. But within those businesses, we can make them thrive with a deep design that is embodied to belong to the future economy that will have to come. And if it doesn't come, actually, we're all a bit doomed. So we have to make this happen. That economy has to arrive. And for that to arrive, the businesses will need to evolve and belong to it.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Thanks to everybody here and thanks to everybody online. I think the questions were really, really good. And I think there's probably some overlap in some of the questions online because everybody's kind of having the same sorts of thoughts about all of this. I'd like to thank you so much, Erinch, for giving us your time this evening. I know that speakers from the Doughnut Economic Action Lab are in very high demand. And I think what has happened tonight is the beginning of a conversation. Certainly between us in TU Dublin and Deal, and I hope for lots and lots of people here that they will go to the website, that they will look at the tools. It's a fantastic website. We are going to hear from the West Cork Doughnut network after the break, as I mentioned to you before, so it'll be interesting to see how they've used the tools. But thank you again so much, and I hope, as I said, we can keep this conversation going, and maybe next time we'll be able to tell you about some of the ways that we have put the tool to use. So thank you very, very much.